The Forest of Fontainebleau, France, 1908. In his study in the Villa Neflier, a middle-aged Englishman puts the finishing touches to a beautiful manuscript and knows he's written a masterpiece. Nothing like The Old Wives' Tale has been written before, a novel revealing the extraordinary in ordinary lives, revolutionary then and still revolutionary 100 years later.
I think that The Old Wives' Tale is Bennett's masterpiece, and it came from a moment. He was in Paris in 1903 and he was in a restaurant and he saw an old woman come in. She was sort of comic. She was carrying lots of bags and she moved around from chair to chair and people started laughing. Particularly, Bennett was rather hurt that a rather beautiful waitress that he had noticed, she was laughing too.
But I thought this woman was once young, slim, perhaps beautiful, certainly free from these ridiculous mannerisms. Her case is a tragedy. One ought to be able to make a heart-rending novel out of the history of a woman such as she. Every stout, aging woman is not grotesque, far from it. But there is extreme pathos in the mere fact that every stout, aging woman was once a young girl, with a unique charm of youth in her form and movements and in her mind.
Eventually, Bennett made it the story of two women, sisters from his own humble background in the Staffordshire potteries, following them from their teens to old age and death. He turned it into a universal story of time and the struggle between the young and the old.
Everyone, when they read it, realises that it's breathtaking in its novelty and its adventurousness. No one's written a novel like that. And actually, no one reads it without realising how good and how new it is.
The Old Wives' Tale, I have to say, is my far and away favourite book.
I'm not wild about the league table view of literature, but if I have to construct one, I think The Old Wives' Tale is certainly in the Premiership and perhaps pushing for a place in Europe.
The Old Wives' Tale put Bennett onto the path to wealth and worldwide fame. Yet 100 years later, the writer and his great masterpiece are forgotten, victims of nothing less than a literary conspiracy led by a then little-known author called Virginia Woolf. This is the story of Britain's most unjustly neglected writer and the campaign of vicious snobbery and envy that destroyed his reputation. This is the story of Arnold Bennett.
Arnold Bennett was one of the great writers in the English language. He's in the Dickens League. He is one of the immortals.
Anchovy sauce, please.
Bennett in his day was the man of letters in England. No one was more famous.
Chop side, finish, please.
Yes, sir. Like Tolstoy and Flaubert, he utterly understood women. He understood servants, he understood people who were seemingly the peripheries of life. He understood humanity.
I need the anchovy sauce as well. We're going to finish the omelette there.
He's a classic writer whose work changed the way we think and live now. And if we've forgotten it, that's our loss.
Probably the best known thing about him now is his omelette at the Savoy, omelette Arnold Bennett. And, you know, a great writer really should be known for more than his omelette.
Crazy river, I've gone crazy too.
On y va, pick up an omelette Arnold Bennett on table 63, please.
At London's Savoy Hotel, you can still order the dish they named after their most famous customer in 1924. A friend of the rich and famous, owner of a luxury yacht, Arnold Bennett had built a vast reputation on the foundation stone of The Old Wives' Tale. But his real fame lay beyond smart hotels, because Arnold Bennett was the people's writer. He transformed their lives into art, and the popular artists of the street repaid the compliment.
My man Fred has just been into the study with news. A pavement artist has done you, sir. Very lifelike. I saw it myself at Hyde Park Corner. A new manifestation of fame.
Bennett had become Britain's greatest ever literary celebrity.
In the last decade of Bennett's life, he was perhaps the most famous writer in the world. He wrote for the press, he wrote popular novels. He was a star. He was a very, very famous figure. Everybody knew who he was.
I don't think there's any writer today who has the fame, sometimes there's notoriety, the almost universal admiration that Bennett had. The most popular novelists in Britain today just can't compare for him with, I guess, recognition in the street, recognition of his name, admiration throughout the entire country.
Bennett knew that eccentricities like his distinctive quiff gave him instant face recognition. But if his understanding of celebrity seems modern to us, his passionate belief in the importance of ordinary lives is perhaps less so. It earned him powerful enemies, and to be celebrated in this most ephemeral art was an ominous portent, because the heights of Bennett's celebrity then are matched only by the depths of his obscurity now.
When I was sitting at a dinner in the Savoy 20 years ago, looking for small talk with the Minister of the Arts, I said, "Did you know that Arnold Bennett had an omelette named after him at the Savoy?" And he said, "No, I didn't know that. Is Arnold Bennett here tonight?" And I thought, well, poor Arnold Bennett, his name has gone. It was an extraordinary sense of the falling away of the reputation of somebody who had been the star of the Savoy Grill into somebody whose very name had been confused with somebody else's or indeed utterly forgotten by the Minister for the Arts.
So famous then, so forgotten now. But the destruction of Bennett's reputation was no accident. A writer more famous in his day than Charles Dickens or J.K. Rowling in theirs, Bennett was deliberately sabotaged, a victim of jealousy and snobbery.
An insignificant little man, and ridiculous to boot.
He looked like a fourth-rate clerk from the Potteries, and out of work at that.
Bennett looked as if he'd come up to London for the cup tie and never gone back.
They just hated him, partly because he was successful, but mainly because he was lower class, vulgar. He was despised, even when he started to be successful, despised by the modernist intellectuals. T.S. Eliot said he looked like a wholesale grocer, you know? What does a wholesale grocer look like? Different from a retail grocer.
They hated him for qualities we would now admire, and the campaign was led by a now revered figure whose own reputation has risen at the expense of her victim.
One reason academics and intelligent readers didn't take Bennett seriously was because Virginia Woolf told us not to take Bennett seriously, and Virginia Woolf was probably the most expert reader of novels in the 20th century. And it's because she is so accurate and intelligent about so many other books that she was so persuasive about Bennett, until you actually bothered to read him.
They destroyed his reputation by sneering at him because he was a jobbing writer and he liked making money. He worked prodigiously hard. And I just find Virginia Woolf almost impossible to read now in her snobbishness. She sneered at him because he came from a lower middle class family and he worked at writing for a living.
But unlike his enemies, and despite his fame and wealth, Bennett never looked down on the masses. And he never forgot those who, unlike himself, hadn't made it.
In the basement of this hotel, very dark, with windows that look on the wall that supports the earth, is the laundry, where human beings work all day at washing linen. We live on top of all that, admiring fine literature and the marvellous scenery.
He was a Democrat. I feel convinced that Bennett, had he been writing today, would have been writing about migrant labour, the poor wages, Filipino slave labour, because unlike so many writers, he, in his bones, knew what it was like to be a servant. He was always fighting the battle of the underclass.
Millions of ordinary readers responded to Bennett's compassion and humanity. In his lifetime, at least, He wasn't just revered, he was loved. They knew the long journey he'd travelled, and at the end of his life in 1931, they paid an extraordinary final tribute.
When he was dying, it was famously said that straw was spread on the streets below his flat in Baker Street so that the rumbling of the traffic wouldn't disturb the dying man.
I've always doubted that story. When we unveiled the plaque on the walls outside in this very block of flats that I live in now, I said, what a lovely story anyway, it shows how popular he was in his own day. And at the end of my talk, a little old lady, she's gone now, but I knew even then she'd lived in this block forever. She came over to me and she said, you know the story you told about the straw outside while Bennett was dying? It is true, you know, I remember it.
They didn't do that for many people, and indeed I think it said that he was the last person for whom straw was spread upon the streets of London. This was like royalty. He was as famous as royalty. And that's a long way to go from the hopeless little Hope Street in the Five Towns.
The Five Towns lie close to the heart of dear old England. They spread across the face of the countryside for many miles. Proud, unique, and indispensable. Do you drink from a cup? Do you eat from a plate? You have the Five Towns to thank for that.
Bennett's origins lay a world away from the glamour of literary London, among the sprawling towns then known as the Potteries, which now make up modern-day Stoke-on-Trent. Bennett gave them a new identity, the Five Towns. As such, they were the source of his fame, but he was always ambivalent about his birthplace.
He writes very vividly about the industrial landscape and very knowledgeably about how it came to be like that. But obviously the potteries were very dirty, the pot banks were filthy, the town planning was non-existent, the place was a mess, and it was, by any conventional standards, ugly.
There's a story that he did once pass through them in a train, and when he passed through the town he grew up in, he pulled the curtain of the train window because he just didn't want to see it.
Yesterday I took the 12.5 back to London, which went through the Potteries. The sight of this district gave me a shudder.
Bennett wanted to escape, not just from the ugliness outside, but from tension at home. The family had known real poverty. Enoch Bennett had worked on a pot bank, then failed as a pawnbroker.
Life was quite grim. They were upwardly mobile, which Bennett always was too. They worked very, very hard. But things were tight and difficult, and I think Bennett never forgot the shadow of hard times and always felt that he had to get away from this very constricted background.
At times, he had had to send Arnold to live in his aunt's drapery shop, a building which he later immortalised as the fictional home of Constance and Sophia, the sisters of the old wives' tale. In the meantime, Enoch Bennett went to night school and at the age of 34 qualified as a solicitor. The epic achievement took its toll on his eldest son.
His father constantly appeared in one form or another in the novels, and his father was clearly a very strong character. I suppose in some ways a very aggressive, a very bullying, a very difficult father to live with. And that very strong character, who the young man is frightened of as well as admiring, is one of the abiding characteristics of Bennett's novel time after time after time.
In Clayhanger, what you see is the portrait of the man that Bennett might have been had he succumbed at the age of 16 or 17 to following his father's tyrannical will.
I'll keep an eye on the shop, thank you very much. That lad's stiffered in there, not but a paper boy till Miss Ingemel's chose to get herself wed. I'll keep an eye on him, thank you. He'll have to come down.
I do spend more time in here than you, Father.
You spend your time? Well, I decide you will. You're not in charge yet, and at this pace you're not likely to be. I'm thinking you lost an order while I was gone.
I said we couldn't do it in the...
I'll say what we can do and in what time. You say nout in future without coming to me. Now, have I put it simply enough for you? Nout, you say, nout. Is it understood?
Yes, Father.
My father was the complete autocrat at home, and I grew up in an atmosphere of sustained effort, of grim sticking it, of silent endurance, of never being beaten by circumstances.
By God, if I ever get the chance, I'll pay you out for this someday.
I'm now glad of it, that the atmosphere was also pietistic religious, in a degree to me utterly exasperating. I spent large portions of time in being bored.
I'm fascinated by Bennett's stammer. As a former stammerer myself, I'm always fascinated to hear about other people's stammers. And one of the psychological explanations of stammering is to do with low self-esteem, a fear that what you've got to say isn't worth saying. And I think you've got here this tough father. I've pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. What are you going to do? You know, there is this report that the father said, Arnold, I don't know what we're going to do about Arnold.
My reading of the damage to Bennett, which in my view he overcame rather heroically, is that as a young man he had to pit himself too strongly against his father's will. And I think this manifested itself in his stammer, which was quite acute and which could easily be seen as a symptom of rebellion against parental authority, that he simply couldn't speak because he was paralysed by his father's presence. I think that he based the death of the old Clayhanger very closely on his father's death.
You've got your knife in the wrong hand.
And Bennett describes with fascinating detail the crumbling of this autocrat as his mind softened.
See, like this. No, leave go. Leave go? Well, how can I show you if you don't leave go?
And I think Bennett's rejoicing in his father's decay creates some of the finest scenes in Clayhanger, extraordinarily vividly observed. It's one of the most powerful deathbed scenes in literature, the scene where the old man, Bennett or Clayhanger, is dying and he's suffering from Cheyne-Stokes breathing. This ghastly, gasping for breath, terrible breathing, was the matter of artistic material to him. But what I find so astonishing is that he managed to cast off the whole sentimentality of the Dickensian world.
Is he dying? He must be.
Dickens was very sentimental, and he couldn't do the kind of death scene that that Bennett could do.